Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. All right, I'm just going to give a very brief description of our exhibit, and I'm going to introduce the rest of our team here. Our exhibit is the 50 years after the fall of Saigon, a new beginning in America. Okay, and right there, right up next. A new beginning in America. So this is a big milestone, 50 years after the end of the Vietnam War. And there'll be a lot of press here in America reflecting on, the lessons of the war, the wounds to the veterans that they still carry. And all those stories need to be told, and they're worthwhile. There also will be a lot of celebrations in the Vietnamese communities for the people that are here. But what we're attempting to do in our exhibit is really look at one very clear and dramatic episode of the Vietnam War, which was the refugee crisis that ensued. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese left then, and in the years to come, millions. More than 1 million are here in America. And sadly enough, hundreds of thousands died at sea. So we're looking, though, at, we've interviewed about 15 people who had this refugee experience. And our exhibit is an attempt to kind of let their stories speak for themselves. The entire exhibit is basically context of their stories and then simply trying to let their voices be heard. I'd like to interview, I've done enough interviewing. I'd like to introduce the rest of our team. To my left is Gwen Martinez, who is a pharmacist, recently married, recently relocated from Florida to Dallas, Texas. I met Gwen last year after the New York encounter. She needed a ride to Washington to visit relatives, and someone said I was going to Washington. And so I gave Gwen a ride, and we talked the whole way down. And I said I had this idea for this project, and she got very excited about it and said, well, if it comes off, I'd really like to be involved in it. And now she regrets that completely. Because she was telling me she's very nervous. She's like, why did I ever say yes to this man? On my right is Chin Pham, who is an old friend of mine. We were housemates back in our bachelor days. But Chin is a father of 5 and a surgeon who lives near Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. I have to say I'm really very glad that Chin is a surgeon, and I'll tell you why. Because he's also a deer hunter. And when we shared a house back then, he was my housemate. We had a second freezer in the basement just to eat all the venison that Chin used to provide for us. But one night I came home and he had this mat spread over the dining room table, and there were all these organs and body parts. And he had this sharp knife, and he was like probing them. And I said, either this guy's got a very strong interest in medicine, or I'm living with Jeffrey Dahmer. And so when he said he wanted to go to medical school, I thought, oh, thank God, he's going to medical school. We have one other member of our team who couldn't come, and that's Tien Nguyen. Tien was my former student, absolutely wonderful kid when he was my student. He now lives in San Antonio, Texas, and he did a lot of work for us. But he couldn't come here because he's joining the National Guard. He's starting his training. He's serving the governor of Texas, hopefully the United States as well. But the connection of Wen and Chin and Tien to this subject is obvious. I think I'm the one who has to explain mine. What is my connection here? I've always had a very strong interest in the Vietnam War, and people are asking me why, and I always have to figure out why. And I think the one reason is, it's a strange phrase to use, but it was the war of my childhood. When I was growing up, there was all this news that was very dramatic. My oldest brother George was in the service at the time of the Vietnam War, and he was in the medical unit. My parents were always worried that he was going to go over, and we were always looking at the news and waiting for the phone call from George. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and so there were huge demonstrations that I remember, and my family and I would watch the sitcoms, Saturday night CBS lineup. And you'd get these news bulletins, about Vietnam. And I actually once walked to school during a riot. I was 10 years old, And it was May Day. It was a day when I think the Students for Democratic Society were going to shut down the district in protest of the Vietnam War. And so I had my little parochial school jacket on and my backpack and my lunch, and I'm walking through a riot. I mean, there's tear gas in the air, National Guardsmen on the street, and these people are lifting up cars and putting them into the street to block it. And there was this one guy, he had long hair and a bandana, and he was carrying something in his hands, and he came up to me and said, do you want some? And I was terrified because I knew he had long hair, which meant he was a hippie. And I knew hippies took drugs, and if he was passing something out, it was probably a drug. And he was actually passing out ice so that people could cope with the tear gas in the air. And he said, do you want some? And I said, no! And to this day, I look back and I ask myself, what the hell were my parents thinking? I was 10 years old, and they had me walking through a riot to school. They were intelligent people. But all this was going on, and then when I was old enough to understand what was all that about, there was a strange silence in the country. The Vietnam War in America was something that produced shame. It was just kind of embarrassing. And some people saw it because the war was all wrong, and other people said it was the humiliation of losing. But no matter which side you're on or how you looked at it, it was this thing that was just embarrassing. And I felt like when I was old enough to understand, nobody wanted to talk about it. So, I was always very, very curious, and began to read a lot. I read all the literature, memoirs, films, and I teach a course. I teach a course in the Vietnam War at my school. And one of the things that's been very powerful in our courses is I invite veterans to come and talk to the class, and these guys are now in their 70s, the younger ones, when they were younger then in the war, so they're older men now. And they still very much want to tell their story, and they're very happy to talk to the students. And the students are very responsive to what they have to say. And I always thought, well, that's a powerful moment. And as this milestone approached, in April will be the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, my first thought was, well, we should really get these veterans to talk, because some of them they have quite remarkable stories. But then it all changed. Everything changed for me at a wedding. I was at the wedding of T. Cow and Rachel Egan, and T's mom and dad were there. And at the wedding, because I'm such a Vietnam buff, I was talking with them. I just asked them questions, a little curious about their take on things. And they both shared with me their stories, which were so remarkable that there's panels up there in the exhibit, both of them. I've interviewed them both later, and there are 2 panels for each one, summarizing those interviews. But their stories were so remarkable, of just leaving there as children and all that they endured and coming here. And you see them now and all they've done, and they were just such striking stories of courage and just resilience in the midst of this crisis. And that changed my mind when I talked to them, and I thought, this would be a good story to tell. This will be a good story to tell. I hope people continue to tell the stories of the veterans, because they need that, and those are all good things. But I thought, this is a real contribution. And then I went to this meeting to plan the New York encounter, and they said the theme was going to be a new beginning. And I thought, well, how appropriate, to talk about these people who left this crisis situation and with incredible courage and resilience, made their way to America and had to begin everything all over again. And of course, these stories are displayed up in the exhibit. But then once I thought, well, this would be a good idea. Then I contacted poor Gwen and said, we're going to do it. And she said, and she agreed. And Chin was very, very, very supportive from the very beginning. And that was the beginning of the project. But I just say a word about what it was to do it. It was a privilege. It really was a privilege to hear people share these stories. Chung Kao was the first person that I interviewed. And these panels, are our attempts to distill those interviews and present them. It's almost a shame that we don't have videos so that you could hear their voices and see their faces as they tell these things, because Chung, for example, he was profoundly moved. He was telling the story about what happened to him when he was 8 years old. And he told me that he had never shared that with anyone outside of his family, and he was clearly very moved to be telling me this story. One thing that comes out of these stories is the admiration they have for their parents. Chin's dad, for example, was not young when he left, but the ones I interviewed mostly were pretty young when they left. And they, like all of us, when you're young, you have no idea of the decisions your parents are making or the choices they have to make. And, the awe that they had, for what their parents lived through and what they had to do was quite striking. And Chung, and there were children, and so you're also the ones I interviewed, and so you're hearing their memories as children, and some of the things they said were very, very striking. Sorry, I will let you guys speak. But like Chung, this is in the exhibit, but Chung was saying, when you're a child, you look at your parents, and if your parents are okay, you're okay, And he said his mother was very, very calm in this absolutely desperate situation. They were on this little boat that wasn't at all fit for the sea, and it was half sinking, overloaded with people, and they see this U.S. ship in the distance, and they're thinking, oh, maybe we can live, and. But he said he didn't ever remember really the people. He wasn't afraid. His mother was there, and she wasn't afraid. He looked at the waves, and he said that he worried that this little boat would get over the next wave. But that was all he was really worried about. And then when they got there, his mother looked up at the U.S. ship and told everyone on the boat to make the sign of the cross and hang out rosaries, and says they have to know that we're not communists. We're not communists. We're Christians. And he remembered all those things. And then he said they threw down a rope ladder. And he was 8 years old and just thought he remembers it as the coolest thing in the world. My parents wouldn't usually let me do this. I'm kind of racing up a rope ladder to get on this U.S. ship. But, it was a privilege, to hear people to share these stories. It was very, very moving. And for me, it was just an honor, to sort of be a witness to these precious memories of their lives. So, just a few more. I'd just say one other thing. Probably not just one, but hopefully just one. For me, as an American, looking at it, as someone who's obviously read a lot about the Vietnam War, I feel a certain shame, in the way our country entered into the history of Vietnam and built up the conflict at a level they didn't really want, and then abandoned them. And I think there was just something really a dirty business about the whole thing. And I always and I asked the people, what do you think? What is your thinking? I interviewed Chung's wife, and she said, well, I wouldn't say betrayal. Betrayal's too hard a word, but it's sort of like a betrayal. She couldn't quite get away with that. But at the same time, she and all the people we talked to, and this was for me was a kind of, I would say, redemptive note in this wonderful work that I was able to do, was that and Chung said this explicitly, because I asked him that question, and he just said, you have to make a distinction between the government of a people and the people. And he said that, he doesn't hold it against the American people that, the politicians and the military made the decisions that they did. And in fact, they're tremendously grateful to be here. And they almost across the board said they were very grateful the way that they were received here. And they named people. Well, Mark Doe is the father of a boy that I teach, and I interviewed him, and he named these teachers in his school, and just how aware they were of his challenges and difficulties, and how much they accompanied him, and they all named that. And for me, that was a very positive thing that I took from the work I did. That there was, the Vietnam War is a sad story in many ways, but it's beautiful that these people came, and now they're with us, and they're part of us. And even in what came out in those interviews was that they were grateful to be here, and they were grateful the way that American people received them, in spite of a lot of the things that the American government did there. But okay, I was trying to keep it at 10, but that's the best I could do. Okay, I'm now going to ask Wen to say a word.
Hi, my name is Wen. So I just wanted to start off with a question Father Maximilian asked me yesterday. So he actually proposed it. Oh, can you hear me okay?
Put it real close to you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so Father Maximilian proposed this question to the group of high school volunteers who are here today. He asked in their small CL group that I had the opportunity and was invited to yesterday, what was the most important thing that happened to me today, he asked. And this question is, I guess, where kind of my answer begins. So I asked myself, what were the most important things that happened to me while working on this exhibit? So for me, there's been this deep desire to know where I came from and to know who I am. So these questions were reawoken 2 years ago while I was helping out with a talk on Our Lady of Guadalupe, who Claudia gave the talk with. Then again, it was reawoken last year while I was carpooling with Tom from New York to DC, where he gave me the space. Thank you, Tom, to talk about my background, my history, and just where I came from, my Vietnamese roots, and what made me who I am today. So then he told me that he taught a course in the history of Vietnam, which really piqued my interest. And then he proposed this upcoming year was the anniversary of the 50th fall of Saigon to the communism regime. So he proposed the idea that maybe we could do an exhibit at the New York Encounter in order to honor this mark in history. And later on, he did follow through, and he invited me to join this exhibit and to be a part of it. And it's been an amazing experience so far. And I was very excited to give him my yes, not knowing how much work we were going to put in for free. Yeah, but I had no idea what was going to be in store for me with this exhibit, and being able I started off with interviewing a couple of Vietnamese people who immigrated to Vietnam after the fall of Saigon. I was very overwhelmed by their stories, especially their suffering, but I was very inspired by the joy and hope present throughout their whole entire stories. I'm just going to speak on 2 individuals that stood out to me out of the 15 that we did interview. So the first is Sister Thuy, and the second is Dung Trung, who's my father. So the first is Sister Thuy, who now lives in San Antonio, Texas. When we spoke on the phone, it was beautiful because we opened up in a long prayer. And through this prayer, she invited Christ, the Holy Family, as well as all of our ancestors to come and to be able to open our hearts and our mind and prepare us for our conversation that we had. So in this moment of prayer, I just remember I just started to cry because I recognized for us to be there in that moment and to even have that moment, there were so many people's lives and stories that had to come before us to be able to make that moment even happen. I realized also that to be able to have this history and this connection with our ancestors meant that we could never truly be alone. Sister Thuy was born in Vietnam 3 months before the fall of Vietnam to communism. She was one of 12 kids. At the time, her dad escaped from the military. He changed his name, and he brought his family into the unknowns of the jungle. There, he began to build boats for them in order to escape. This struck me because he had the choice between remaining in fear or risking everything, including his family's lives, in order to find a better life, not only for himself, but for his family and those who he helped. You have to visit the encounter to see their escape story, so I'm not going to ruin that part. But another thing that really struck me, another event that really struck me, was once they made it to America, Sister Thuy had to work in a sweatshop as a 7-year-old. All she did was go to school, come home, go to school, come home, and then she wouldn't sleep sometimes till 2 a.m. in the morning just because they needed that money, even though she was only 7. Her only breaks were called thiếu nhi thân thể, which were youth groups, is what we would call them in America. She kept mentioning how school and sweatshops were so normal to her. But it also helped her realize the importance of thiếu nhi thân thể, which helped her to be able to recognize like the extraordinary of it. And she also said like thiếu nhi thân thể also created her into this person who she is today and helped her with her vocation of becoming a sister. And without these mundane moments, I realized the extraordinary moments would not be as valuable. And this helped me to realize that we really do need to pay attention to every moment, because, including the mundane moments that she was talking about with school and work, because that is also part of our history. But it is only a part of our history if we allow it. The next person's story that I'm going to talk about is Dung Trung, who's my dad. So I'll just start by saying I am Vietnamese, and I was born in a Malaysian refugee camp. The conditions in the camps were tough. There were days where my parents went without food. When my mom was pregnant with me, there were smoke bombs that were thrown into her living space, causing her to vomit lots of blood. This made them think that she was having a miscarriage. Luckily, that wasn't the case. So it's important for me to see my parents' journey up until this point. So my dad is one of 7 kids. He grew up very poor, especially after his father abandoned his family. His mom was left to provide for the family on her own. One of his siblings actually died because they couldn't afford food and didn't have enough food. My dad quit elementary school and started working at a very young age, but he recalled in 1975 that his living condition became much worse once Saigon fell to the communists. One experience that he told me was that the family was living in a small leaf house on someone else's land. One day his mom was selling soup and coffee in the owner's house, and the communists suddenly showed up with grenades and blew up the home. And this resulted in many wounded, including his mom, but thank God she was still alive. But this also resulted in many deaths. He told me he recalled seeing bodies just laying on the ground, but from this day, he was determined to leave Vietnam in order to help himself and to help his family. So my dad tried to escape Vietnam for 14 years after the communists took over. He did continuously fail because he was poor and his lack of social connections. Despite this, he kept trying. And I guess for context, he told me there were 2 different waves of those who left Vietnam. He told me the first wave was people who had a little bit of more money as well as more connection. And the second group, he said, were those of us who just had to keep trying. So instead of allowing defeat, despite the many failures, he continued to try. Whether this meant begging for people for money, including his own family, traveling long distances, or being imprisoned, he was able to keep trying. This impacts me because if he can keep trying despite all these obstacles, like why wouldn't I keep trying? Like why would I let small challenges defeat me? My dad fought his whole entire life for this moment and for me now, so why would I just throw this gift away? Something else that struck me was that my dad wasn't religious at all. But through his journey, he was able to find God, and through that, joy and peace. So one moment that called him closer to Christ was an experience he was able to have on a boat. So there were 29 people stacked on this small boat, and they had no idea where they were going or if they were going to make it out dead or alive. They were lost at sea for about 6 days, but in the midst of all of this, when death seemed so sure, he looked up and he prayed to God, "God and Mary, please help me to land safely, and I will surrender my life to you. I will become Catholic." Miraculously, at 8 p.m. that night, they landed in Malaysia, and this is where his journey to Catholicism began. So this is important because this is where my faith comes from. Not only from my own experience, but from my dad's experience. When he told me about surrendering his life to Christ, I realized that I was a part of that too, even though I was not yet born. I cannot deny the experience that my dad has, and this teaches me to see Christ. Because if my dad was not able to see Christ, like, who would have taught me to see Christ? So seeing my dad as an example and seeing his action through committing his life to Christ in that moment, this is what provides the foundation for me in my faith. His suffering definitely didn't stop there, because when we got to Malaysia and to the United States, it didn't stop, but he acknowledged that there was a difference between suffering with Christ and suffering on his own. So in this camp, my mom was not able to produce any breast milk when I was born. So they were telling me that they cut her finger and her wrist in order to feed me their blood in order to sustain me. But even despite this obstacle, they remained so joyful and so hopeful. They said that they were able to make it to Malaysia, so they knew that they could make it to America. And when they did arrive to America, they didn't know anyone, or they didn't know the language, and they both only had an elementary school experience or education. It was difficult for them, but there were so many people who helped them along the way. There was an old grandpa that taught my dad how to drive, and people who taught him how to look for jobs. The government provided clothing as well as food and shelter for him. And this allowed him to work and to make money in order to, help my sister and I and my mom, and even send money back to his family in Vietnam, as well as those who helped him. So my dad has strongly reminded us over the years to acknowledge and thank those who have helped us to get to where we are. The kindness and love that he received filled him so much so that he can't help but to continue helping those around him, especially those who just arrived to America. He still continuously, to this day, teach others to drive, help them find jobs. And he sends money to those in Vietnam, even now, 27 years later, for birthday, anniversary. Every year he does, as a gift, as a thank you, because he never forgets. Now, talking about my dad, I can see that although he, amidst great suffering throughout his life, the joy was so much greater. And I know he doesn't regret any of that. So I just also want to take this time to thank you, Tom, for inviting me to work on this exhibit, because it has meant a lot for my life, and for Chin and the whole team who just allowed me to, share these stories and share myself and work together. To reflect on these individuals' lives, because it's so important. Their lives have and will continuously inspire me. It's deepen my desire to learn even more about my history so that I can pay attention to everything that's happening in this moment. because this history, my history, is the reason for my hope.
I want to thank Tom for allowing me to participate in this exhibit. In the interest of time, I just wanted to share 2 points. The first point that I learned from this exhibit is that we all have a history, and I would encourage everyone to ask their parents, their grandparents about their story, because we all have a story of our lives. The second point that I just wanted to briefly share that struck me from working in this exhibit is that America is a land of immigrants, and it really saddens me that illegal immigrants are demonized in the United States. You know, while there are some criminals, most of the people that are here to work, to support their families, and they're escaping war, violence, poverty, and we should remember that. So I think the other thing to remember too is that Christ came among us, and he was a refugee with Mary and Joseph in Egypt, and that our faith asks us to face this crisis with love, mercy, and also creativity, which our movement shows us. So that's all I'd like to say in the interest of time. Thank you.
Marcy asked me if I wanted to say a few words. No, but just come to the exhibit. We'll be there Sunday, so come on up tomorrow and see.